So before we give you the instructions for the small groups, I just want to ask my colleagues Debilyn and John to say a word about what's happening in the next 2 years, because there's a couple of things you might want to get involved in, and let them just take a few minutes, just a couple minutes each, to tell you what's happening now and in the future, and then we'll go to the small groups. Debilyn and John.
So I first met all these folks at the Reuniting America events back in the late 2000s, and really felt like I'd come home to my tribe. And I just have to say that, you know, especially I'd run for office several years earlier, didn't know that I was a transpartisan. I just knew that I had Republicans and Democrats and Green Party members all working on my campaign. And so when I found this transpartisan way of doing politics, if you will, I was so thrilled to be at home with people that understood that we can do this for all of us and not just for the parties. In October, we actually gathered a group of 40 people from different political persuasions and organizations in Washington, D.C., or just outside. And we came together and decided that we really wanted to work together in a much more comprehensive way than just these retreats that we'd been having over the years. And so one of the things that we did after that retreat was decide to put some working groups together so we could actually have projects to collaborate on and start practicing that which we're talking about. I chose to work on the communications team and wanted to just share a little bit about that with you tonight, because we're trying to figure out what communications, because of that information overwhelm that John shared with us, what is the information that we most want to have, and in what form do we want to receive it? And then how do we want to participate with it so that it's not just a static piece of information that we're receiving about what's happening with the transpartisan field. And to that end, we know we're going to be building a website. We know we're going to be sending out an email probably monthly that talks about everything that's happening that we can find out about. There's going to be forms that people can enter to give us that information that we can then send back out. We're talking about being on social media so things can spread, even though it's not necessarily the place to have a conversation. It is a place to find out about things and events. And then the last thing I'm going to mention before I turn it over to John is a speakers bureau, because, you know, on those Sunday morning talk shows, we've got all those talking heads up there that are feeding the fight. And we don't have anybody up there because it doesn't sell to the market, and we need to find a way that it will and create the appetite for this collaborative problem solving so that we can have a healthcare system that is the most expensive but yet the best in the world instead of not. Because that is what we deserve in this country. And actually around the world, everybody does. And this is just, this communication strategy and platform and infrastructure we're putting together is really in service to all of us. And then also in service to the field itself so that we can grow and attract more people, which John is now going to tell you a little bit more about.
Before I follow on with what Debilyn said, I want to say two things. I had the privilege of meeting Jane Wales in the early 80s with an organization called the Committee for National Security. And as Mark said, over the years, I have found that my friends have become my heroes. You have been one of my long-term heroes. Thank you. And the other kind of intro, there are a couple of friends in the room. We had a dear friend who in the 80s traveled around the world, and she would sit on a park bench, and she had a sign that said, "American willing to listen." And it is time for us to sit on our own park benches. Hear, hear. A transpartisan willing to listen. And the other thing she did, which was amazing, and it's the first time I'd heard these words put together, she wrote a book, and the title of that book was called Heart Politics. And I think part of what we're engaging in, and Betsy mentioned this in her talk in Boulder, is heart politics. How do we bring love, compassion, generosity, caring, and kindness back into the public square? So we're working at a communication and coordination level, both with leaders and organizations, but also with citizens. I want to focus on two things. One we're calling an Alliance for Transpartisan Initiatives. And these are the transpartisan coalitions that we've heard about tonight in areas such as criminal justice, defense budget reform, alternative complementary and integrative medicine, and almost anything we can find. There are a remarkable number of strange bedfellows working together because of the transpartisan matrix that Laurie alluded to. And one of our jobs is to formalize this. Ralph Nader wrote what some people think is his most important book just this year. How many people have heard, I guess I'm not supposed to do this because I'm on YouTube, but I'm going to do it anyway. How many people have heard about the book called Unstoppable? So Nader's book is called Unstoppable, The Emerging Left-Right Alliance to Dismantle the Corporate State. And if you haven't seen it, it's worth reading. He gives utter balance to conservatives and liberals, history and ideology and framework, and very similar to what Bill and others have talked about is how do we integrate the best on both sides. So that's something we're going to be working on. The other thing is that I've been passionate for decades about how do we heal across the political divides. And in fact, Laurie's co-author, Jim Turner, and I founded an organization in '83 called Project 8488. Here we are 30 years later. The interesting concept that we're working with, and we're having a design team meeting about this in a few weeks, would be the idea of a national convening in 2016 that would likely precede the Democratic and Republican National Convention and really focus on three things. One would be this new narrative, a narrative that's not just left and right. The other would be to showcase on what's working in this country. Really millions of Americans working together at local levels, leaders who are putting country above party, new forms of decision-making and collaboration that actually works and really needs to complement how the system works, because the issues are too complex to kind of solve them with a system that we birthed some hundreds of years ago. And lastly is this notion of a transpartisan social movement. And we're open to people's input. We'd love not only to have you sign up on an email list, but send us emails about any thoughts, ideas, resources, relationships that you have that can help us as we move forward. Don't let your good thinking and your own creativity leave this room without letting us know where you're at and how we can work together. Thanks a lot.